3 antique keys, a cracked leather folder bearing a dead queen's crest, and one single sentence from a lawyer that erased 15 years of quiet, comfortable certainty in a single morning. That was the scene inside the cold estate office at Ravensmere on a freezing British morning, a morning that would permanently rewrite the power map of the royal family. No cameras, no press releases, no palace spokesperson choosing careful words, just a room full of people who had all arrived expecting something very different from what they were about to receive. Prince William sat at the head of a heavy wooden table. Beside him, 2 senior royal solicitors with matching black document cases. Across from him, Camilla's children, her extended family, and King Charles himself, all of whom had walked through those gates that morning, believing they were attending a routine formality. A rubber stamp, a box to tick before the renovations began. They were not expecting what came next. And here is what makes this story unlike anything this family has faced in modern times. The weapon that ended their claim wasn't wielded by William at all. It was loaded, cocked, and aimed by 2 women who died years before any of this happened, women who had seen this day coming with startling precision. They prepared for it, planned for it, and quietly sealed the fate of Camilla's family before Charles even put a ring on her finger. By the time that leather folder was opened on the table, the outcome had already been decided for 26 years. Stay with me, because every detail of this story matters. The arrival that nobody read correctly. Let's begin at exactly 8:46 in the morning. That is the precise time a single dark, unassuming vehicle slipped quietly through the eastern gates of the Ravensmere estate. No motorcade, no official announcement, no outriders or flashing lights to signal that the Prince of Wales had arrived. Just one car. But notice what stepped out behind William. 2 of the most senior royal solicitors in the kingdom, each carrying an identical black document case. Now pause and ask yourself, when does a prince bring 2 lawyers on what everyone else believes is a routine family visit about renovation plans? You don't. That is the first sign. And nobody in Camilla's family caught it. The second sign came when William didn't go inside through the main entrance. He walked straight past the sweeping stone staircase. He ignored the grand main doors. He crossed the wet, freezing gravel courtyard and slipped around the side of the historic house to the old estate office. The damp, forgotten room at the back of the property, where raw land records had been stored under lock and key since the reign of Queen Victoria. Think about what that choice communicates. The grand drawing room was available, fires were already burning, tea was waiting, his family was inside. And William walked past all of it to go directly to the room where the paperwork lived. This was not a family gathering. It never was. It was something else entirely. By 9 that morning, a staff member quietly informed Camilla that William was in the building. According to people close to the family, her immediate assumption was that he had come to discuss the renovation timeline. This was entirely reasonable, given the context. The east wing of the manor needed significant structural work. 2 of the ancient lead roofs were actively leaking. There had even been ongoing discussions about modernizing several of the outer cottages so that members of Camilla's extended family could use them year-round. She had no reason to think otherwise. For 15 years, nobody had given her one. Here is what the household staff tells you about how settled this arrangement appeared to everyone. One of the brightest rooms on the upper floor of the manor had been officially designated by the staff themselves as Mr. Parker Bowles's study. That morning, a member of the household had gone into that room and placed fresh, expensive flowers on the windowsill. Fresh flowers. In a room they had already mentally handed over to a new owner. Hold that image in your mind. By sunset, those same flowers would be quietly carried back out. 15 years of warm promises. To understand the full weight of what happened in that cold records room, you need to understand what Camilla's family genuinely believed and, more importantly, why they believed it. They weren't operating on fantasy. They weren't simply being presumptuous. They had been told, repeatedly, over the course of more than a decade, that Ravensmere would be theirs, not in writing, not through a formal legal instrument, but in the way that powerful, wealthy families often make promises to one another quietly, over dinner, in private rooms, with the confidence of people who believe they don't need a piece of paper to make something real. King Charles had said 5 specific words on multiple occasions, 5 words that turned out to be the most expensive words he ever spoke. You'll always have Ravensmere. And when a reigning king tells you that, you believe him. You invest in that belief. You plan around it. You build a life on the foundation of it. Camilla's family did all of those things. Detailed architectural plans were commissioned and paid for. Rare custom furniture was measured specifically to fit through Ravensmere's historic doorways. One relative had begun discussing bringing a collection of show horses to the estate's southern paddocks. Camilla's son was shown the underground wine cellar and was specifically told which vintage bottles belonged to the house and which ones he was free to open whenever he visited. Think about that. He was told which bottles he could open. You don't tell someone which wine belongs to them in a house they'll never own. That is the language of inheritance, of permanence, of settled ownership. Year after year, every time Camilla's family passed through those iron gates, they were treated as future owners. The staff spoke to them that way. The renovations were planned that way. The study was named that way. And then Prince William sat down in the records room and said 4 words that dismantled all of it. None of you were ever beneficiaries. Understand what he didn't say. He didn't say, "You've lost the estate." He didn't say, "I've decided to take it back." Those phrases would have implied that something was being taken from them, that they had possessed it and were now losing it. William was far more precise than that, and his precision was devastating. He reached backwards, past the wine cellar tour, past the furniture measurements, past the flower arrangements, and the study nameplates. He went all the way back to the very beginning, before any of them had ever set foot on the property, and he told them that none of it had ever had legal standing. Not a single promise, not a single warm word, not 15 years of quiet, comfortable certainty. That is not a loss. That is an erasure. Anger says, "You crossed a line." What William said was far colder. There was never a line for you to cross. The leather folder and the ghost of the Queen Mother. Camilla entered the estate office just after 9:20 in the morning. Charles followed a few minutes later, visibly irritated, and here is the important detail. Not yet about the legal situation itself, but because this matter had not been brought to him privately first. He felt bypassed, disrespected. That tells you something significant about where Charles believed his authority sat in this room. He was about to learn differently. William was already seated at the table when Charles walked in, one hand resting on a faded, cracked leather folder. Charles looked at that folder the moment he entered the room, and something changed in his face, because he recognized what was on the cover. The faded gold crest belonged to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. In that instant, before a single legal document had been opened or read aloud, the confidence drained from Charles's expression. He understood instinctively, the way people who have grown up around old money and older power understand these things, that something significant was happening. He just didn't yet know precisely what. Here is where the story shifts from a royal family disagreement into something far more intricate. Ravensmere was not purchased by Charles. It was not gifted to Camilla by the crown. It was not standard crown estate property. It was buried within a private family settlement, a complex legal structure built decades earlier, altered 3 specific times, designed to protect the land and everything on it from the unpredictable currents of royal marriages, divorces, and deaths. The First Amendment protected the land from ever being sold. The Second protected the historic house from demolition. The third, and this is the one that ended everything for Camilla's family, secured the succession clause. The precise legal language outlining exactly who could inherit Ravensmere and who could not, under any circumstances, regardless of how the family structure around it changed. And what Charles had held for all of these years was not ownership. It was something the legal world calls a life interest. He could live at Ravensmere. He could manage the grounds, host parties, earn income from the working farms. He could treat it, for every practical purpose, as his own. But he had never held the legal authority to decide what happened to it after him. Not through a quiet promise, not through a handwritten letter, not even through a royal command, as the reigning king of England. He held the keys to the house for his lifetime. He never held the right to pass them on. For 15 years, he had promised he would. For 15 years, everyone in that room had believed him. The Margaret Protocol, a checkmate written in 1999, when Camilla's daughter asked what seemed like a perfectly reasonable question: if the king holds the estate during his lifetime, why can't he decide what happens after? The royal solicitor opened the leather folder, and what he read froze the room. Because that choice was taken from him before his marriage, not after, before it. Someone had anticipated this exact moment. They had seen Charles and Camilla coming years before anyone else acknowledged it publicly, and they had closed the door to the Parker Bowles family's inheritance long before anyone in that family had ever dreamed of walking through it. The room assumed it was Queen Elizabeth II. They all looked at William, waiting for him to say Her Majesty's name. He didn't. It wasn't her. The binding change to Ravensmere's succession clause was signed in late 1999, 3 years before the Queen Mother passed away, 6 years before Charles and Camilla's wedding, at a time when their relationship, though whispered about, had not yet been publicly acknowledged. 2 signatures were on that document. The first, shaky with age, belonged to the Queen Mother. The second, bolder and more decisive, belonged to Princess Margaret. Now the room was no longer just legally tense. It was deeply, unexpectedly personal. Margaret, the woman who had watched her sister's marriage destroyed, the woman who had been denied her own happiness in the name of the institution, the woman who understood, better than almost anyone alive, how a second marriage could fracture what a dynasty had spent generations building. Margaret had sat in a trustee meeting, years before any of this came to a head, and raised a concern that nobody else had dared to articulate. She worried, on the record, that Ravensmere could pass through a second marriage to a family member that the original settler had never anticipated. She didn't name anyone. She didn't need to. The legal language she insisted on made her position absolute. No spouse, no child of a spouse, and no descendant unrelated by direct blood to the line of King George VI shall ever gain permanent title, controlling interest, or beneficial ownership. Sit with that for a moment. Camilla's children were not named in that clause. They didn't need to be. The clause was written in 1999, years before anyone outside the tightest inner circle even knew how serious Charles's relationship with Camilla had become. 2 royal women had looked ahead, calculated the risk, and sealed off the future with a precision that was almost architectural in its design. Princess Margaret didn't just protect Ravensmere, she predicted the exact argument that would unfold in that cold estate office 26 years later, and she wrote the counter-argument first. When Charles claimed he had not known about the exclusion clause, William placed a signed document in front of him. The document bore the date November 1999. It bore Charles's own signature. The same man who had spent 15 years saying, "You'll always have Ravensmere," had signed, with his own hand, a document that made that promise legally impossible to honor. For a few long moments, Charles said nothing. The solicitor had to step in to keep the meeting moving forward. 2 proposals and a fatal mistake. What came next is where you see the true sophistication of the trap that had been set. Charles's legal team had not arrived unprepared. They had read the 1999 amendment. They had studied it, and they had arrived at the estate office that morning with 2 proposals. The first was direct. Create a new trust and name Camilla's children as the beneficiaries. Clean, simple, and completely caught by the language Margaret had insisted on in 1999. William dismissed it without extended discussion. The second proposal was where things became interesting. Someone on Charles's side had genuinely understood the 1999 amendment and looked for the gaps. A 99-year lease at £1 per year, a century of access without any transfer of title. The royal bloodline would retain ownership on paper. Nothing would officially change hands. The Parker Bowles family would simply be living there for 100 years as tenants, in the loosest possible sense of the word. On paper, it was clever. It was the kind of legal architecture that shows real thought, and it tells you something important. This second proposal proves that Charles's team understood the 1999 amendment. You don't accidentally construct a detailed workaround for a clause you didn't know existed, but the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret had anticipated this move too. The amendment contained a specific provision. Any agreement extending beyond 21 years required the unanimous consent of all trustees. William was the final decision-maker among them. He declined. Think about what those 2 women achieved. They didn't just write a rule, they wrote a rule, anticipated the most creative ways a future king might attempt to bypass it, and blocked those paths before anyone had even begun to walk them. A direct transfer blocked. A new trust blocked. A cleverly disguised century-long lease blocked. Every exit from the legal structure they had constructed was sealed from the inside. They had been gone for years. They had won anyway. But here is where Charles made the mistake that turned a difficult morning into a permanent crisis. 3 weeks after those 2 proposals were rejected, private contractors appeared at the gates of Ravensmere. They did not come to fix the leaking roofs. They came with measuring tape and clipboards. They surveyed the entire West Wing. They inspected the historic kitchens. They assessed whether the long nursery corridor could be converted into luxury apartments. Nobody informed Prince William. The survey cost £18,400. It was charged to a hidden estate maintenance account, an account that William oversees as part of his trustee responsibilities. He noticed the charge while reviewing routine maintenance invoices. The label read, "Future Occupancy Adaptation." He pulled the surrounding financial records, and there it was, a large furniture order, custom mahogany shelving, a glass-fronted wine room. The name on the order was not King Charles. It was not Queen Camilla. It was Parker Bowles. This was the moment the situation moved beyond a family disagreement. When you use trust funds to prepare a property for people who have been legally excluded from inheriting it, you are not having a domestic argument. You are creating a paper trail. You are leaving a record. And when the trustee sees that record, they do not have the option to look away. William didn't come to Ravensmere that morning because he wanted to. He came because the financial records had created a legal obligation that he could not ignore. The confrontation at the table. When the full picture was laid out in the records room, Camilla pushed back, and to her credit, she wasn't wrong on the surface level. No lease had been signed. The furniture hadn't been installed. The surveys were preliminary. Nothing was final. Nothing had actually transferred. William acknowledged all of that, and then he made his own position clear. He wasn't accusing anyone of theft. He was demonstrating intent. He was showing that the estate was being prepared for an inheritance that the law had explicitly prohibited, and that trust funds had been used to pay for those preparations. Assurances are not legal ownership, he said, referring directly to the promises Charles had made. Charles told him this could have been handled privately. William replied that it was private until trust money was spent on the property. That one exchange tells you everything about where this family stood on the question of institutional accountability versus family loyalty. But then William did something nobody had anticipated. Camilla's daughter pointed out, with reasonable logic, that Ravensmere would ultimately pass to William anyway. He was the heir. He was the trustee. If anyone was positioned to benefit from the estate's succession chain, it was him. 9 days before that meeting, William had formally renounced his own claim to Ravensmere. He didn't want the estate, he wanted to control its future, and by renouncing his claim, he triggered a succession cascade that would produce a result nobody in that room had seen coming. Without William, the next name in the line was Harry, but Harry's name had never been included in the original settlement. The structure passed over him. Princess Anne had chosen to step aside. Prince Andrew had been disqualified when he stepped back from royal duties, which left one name, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, the quiet man at the end of the line. There is a particular kind of power that belongs to people who don't appear to want anything. The quiet man at the end of the line. There is a particular kind of power that belongs to people who don't appear to want anything. It is the most disarming power of all, because nobody plans for it. Everyone around that table had been operating under the assumption that this dispute would ultimately resolve into someone gaining something, that a winner would emerge who would take the keys and live in the manor and benefit from the farms and the lake and the 42 cottages and the historic paintings that had never appeared in any public inventory. They were right that a winner would emerge. They were completely wrong about what winning would look like. Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, accepted the inheritance of Ravensmere. He accepted it on one condition: the estate would not become his private residence. The farms, the cottages, the grounds, the resources of the entire property would be directed toward a charitable foundation, one that would provide retreats and support for wounded veterans, bereaved military families, and young people aging out of the foster care system. He inherited one of the finest private estates in England, and he immediately gave almost all of its benefits away. Think about what this did to the narrative around the table. If Edward had claimed Ravensmere as his personal estate, Camilla's family would have had a villain, a royal opportunist who had stepped in and taken something they had been promised. That story is clean and satisfying. It gives you someone to resent. Instead, they lost the estate to a quiet man who refused to treat it as personal property, who looked at 12,000 acres of prime British land, a Jacobean manor, 42 cottages, 2 working farms, and a pristine private lake, and decided the people who deserved it most were veterans and children who had no one left to fight for them. You cannot resent that. You cannot build a sympathetic public narrative against a man who gave away his inheritance for the benefit of wounded soldiers and bereaved families. Edward had not just accepted the estate, he had made it impossible for anyone to paint him as the villain of this story. The keys and the note. William handed 3 keys to Edward's solicitor. Each key unlocked a different section of the estate: the east wing, the main house, the outer farm buildings. Only one space was reserved for Edward's personal family use, a small private chapel set aside for quiet reflection and remembrance. The rest of Ravensmere now belonged, in every meaningful sense, to those who needed it most. The changes moved quickly. By evening, the nameplate had been removed from the study door on the upper floor. The keys were transferred from beneath Charles's portrait to a simple wooden box. Inside the box, Edward had placed a handwritten note. It read, "Let this house belong to those who need it." And somewhere in the house, staff members quietly carried the fresh flowers out of the room that was no longer Mr. Parker Bowles's study. What this story really tells us. Step back from the legal architecture for a moment. Step back from the life interests and succession clauses and the 21-year threshold and the Margaret Protocol. Step back from all the specific detail and ask the broader question. What did you just watch happen? You watched a reigning king discover that the power he thought he held, the quiet personal power to reward his wife's family with one of England's great estates, was never his to exercise. Not because someone took it from him, but because the people who loved the institution more than they loved him had quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary foresight removed that power years before he tried to use it. You watched Prince William arrive not as a grandson grieving for a property, not as a jealous rival competing with stepbrothers, but as a trustee doing his legal duty. He gave up his own claim to the estate. He asked for nothing for himself. He walked into that records room to protect an institution, not to benefit from it. You watched 2 women, long dead, extend their reach across decades and win an argument they weren't alive to witness. Princess Margaret, who understood better than anyone what happens when the wrong people get close to royal assets, and the Queen Mother, who signed her name beside Margaret's with a steady recognition that some things are too important to leave to chance or sentiment. And you watched Prince Edward, the family member nobody ever built a storyline around, become the quiet answer to a very loud question, not by fighting for the estate, not by outmaneuvering anyone, but simply by being the person left standing when everyone else had been eliminated, disqualified, or had walked away, and then choosing to do something genuinely good with what remained. So who really won in that freezing estate office on that particular morning? Was it William, who surrendered a property he could have kept in order to control an outcome that served the institution he will one day lead? Was it Edward, who accepted an inheritance and immediately redirected its benefits toward people who will never know his name? Or was it the 2 women who sat in a trustee meeting in 1999, asked the question nobody else was willing to ask, and built a legal structure so watertight that even a king with 15 years of promises behind him couldn't find a way through it? Here is what I believe. The real winner was the institution itself, the understanding that within this family, within this system, the personal and the legal are not the same thing. That a word from a king, however warmly intended, however sincerely meant, is not the same as a right. That the people who protect these structures sometimes do their best work invisibly, in rooms most people will never enter, writing clauses most people will never read, for the benefit of a future they will not live to see. Ravensmere is not a warm family home tonight. It is not a private retreat for the Parker Bowles family. The study that was so recently named and furnished and decorated with fresh flowers is quiet now. But the estate's cottages, its grounds, its resources, they will shelter people for whom a safe, quiet place is not a luxury but a lifeline. That is not the ending anyone in that room expected. It may be the best ending available. Now I want to hear from you, because this story raises a question worth sitting with. Was Prince William right to enforce the legal documents the way he did, even knowing that Charles had made those promises to Camilla's family in good faith? Or should family loyalty have found a way to override the legal structure? Where does a king's word end and a trustee's duty begin? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story surprised you, if you had no idea that the legal architecture beneath the royal family's property arrangements was this layered, this deliberate, this far-reaching, then you need to see what's coming next. Because the Ravensmere settlement is one document, and where there is one, there are others. This family's past is never truly settled. Hit subscribe, and we'll keep pulling at the thread together.